Disclaimer, this video isn't either feedback report or content analysis, but at the same time it is both. What do I mean by this? Well, originally I was going to play the game all the way through and do a standard feedback report, which normally takes about 2 to 3 days to complete. I started to outline the script as I normally do, and then it got bigger, and bigger, and bigger, until I had pages of bullet points. I took a look at how some people wrote their reviews, and considering the sheer amount of content in this game, it was impossible to find one that dived into its cavernous depth. The game is filled to the brim with stuff that needs to be highlighted, not only on its own merits but also in comparison to its spiritual predecessors. And even though this game has been out for a month or so in the States, I'm sure people watching this would want a spoiler-free deconstruction of its elements. Unfortunately, it's impossible to discuss the story without spoiling anything, and the visuals do spoil some of the narrative. So, what I've done is this. I've written the analysis to be as spoiler-free as possible if you are listening to it instead of watching it. I'm going to give this game some context from a personal and business standpoint, I'm going to talk about the presentation, then I'm going to talk about the gameplay. Once that's done, I'm going to warn you that we're heading into spoiler territory, which will give you ample time to skip to the conclusion, which will be spoiler-free. Please keep in mind that the majority of this review was written and recorded before the 20th of April. I have done some re-recordings here and there, but any outdated information regarding some elements will be mentioned after the vanilla version of those same pieces. With that in mind, let's talk about Bloodborne at length. And don't worry about the footage on screen, it was captured early in the game and it doesn't give off anything major. The year is 2013, Grand Theft Auto 5 was released, Papers, Please surprised everyone, David Cage disappoints yet again, and the 8th generation consoles finally arrived. The release of the systems was both covered in praise and controversy. The Xbox One, despite going back on its consumer-unfriendly practices, was tainted with the bad PR that both its announcement and its always-online requirement had generated.
Fortunately, we have a product for people who aren't able to get some form of connectivity. It's called Xbox 360.
Right. So stick with 360, that's your message if you don't, like it?
If you have zero access to the internet, that is an offline device. I mean, seriously, when I read the blogs and thought about who's really the most impacted, there was a person who said, hey, I'm on a nuclear sub.
Right.
And I don't even know what it means to be on a nuclear sub, but I've got to imagine that it's not easy to get an internet connection.
Sony capitalized on these controversies and as a result generated the most hype.
For instance, PlayStation 4 won't impose any new restrictions on the use of PS4 gamers. Guess that's a good thing.
And if its sales figures are anything to go by, it's getting close to outselling both its competitors combined. During the run-up to the Christmas period, I got myself a PS4, and I have to admit, I've been disappointed with the system so far. It didn't help that 2014 was a year clouded by mediocre games and re-releases. Comparing the exclusives already out to the ones available on the Xbox One shows a very uneven comparison. Something that makes them look like they want to put out more tech demos rather than good games. My machine has been used for multi-platform releases, and at times I wondered why I got this system in the first place. I've been getting increasingly busy over the past year, from working on a motion capture technology dissertation to starting a master's degree, so when I get the opportunity to rest, I want to make sure my time is spent wisely. This isn't just me wanting more good games on my expensive black box, but it's also a question of good business as to how the PlayStation 4 has been struggling to find long-lasting exclusives. Most of the exclusive titles that have been released have not only been underwhelming, but it's also been completely forgotten. Remember Knack? That was a launch title. I almost forgot PT existed until the recent news surrounding Kojima's departure broke, and I had to try really hard to find that one. And I can't even count that anymore considering how bitter that divorce got. Shame really. The fact that exclusives are being instantly forgotten isn't only bad for the console, but also bad for the industry as a whole. As much as people want consoles to die so everything can move to the PC, that isn't even a desirable situation economically. If anyone remembered the 1983 crash, then they would know that E.T. and Pac-Man didn't cause the crash. What caused the crash was a collection of bad games sold for both cheap and high prices, and Atari being dishonest and insane. And looking at the Steam store seems to invoke those same conditions. As much as PC saves money in the long term, the constant internet connection requirement to receive even offline games, how easy it is to misunderstand the numbers on PC components, and the expensive entry fee doesn't make this direction desirable. Even when you have the game, how do you know your rig can handle it? Cities Skylines said that my system can handle ultra settings, but when actually playing the game it lagged like crazy. At least with consoles, I can guarantee that the games will work, and if my system crashes or gets destroyed, I can rest assured that the physical copy of the game isn't lost with it. The PS2 era really kickstarted decent competition that made way for some great exclusives. But since one of the three systems is not releasing anything memorable or even half good, what's to stop the other companies from doing the same? That's why we need good exclusives, regardless of what system you have, but I digress. So far, the first quarter of 2015 has neatly encapsulated 2014 into a quarter of its original packaging. You got a strange game that became weirdly popular, you got a re-release that nobody asked for, and games that were coming out that were unremarkable at best and terrible at worst. The good games that do come out normally come from smaller, more independent groups, but the games industry as a whole has struggled to make that one big hit of the year. The difference is that now we have a strong contender for 2015's Game of the Year, which is where Bloodborne comes in. Here we have a game that has the DNA of the Souls series, made by the creators of the Souls series, and made by the director of my favourite game of all time. That's right, Dark Souls is my favourite game of all time. Despite its flaws, it's nothing but complete genius in functional and contextual levels. With largely the same team from Demons and Dark Souls and Bloodborne, it's also incredibly hard to completely distance Bloodborne from those games, especially if one of those games is close to your heart. But regardless of what angle you look at the game at, it's hard to deny that the PlayStation 4 has its first champion. If Bloodborne has taught me anything, it's that From Software and Miyazaki's team have perfected a formula, where they take the DNA from their difficult RPGs and change it enough to be both familiar and different when compared to their previous titles, not just aesthetically, but also on a gameplay standpoint. The company knows how to craft great experiences expertly, to the point that the audience are not only willing to overlook its flaws, but to also forget that this is a company that has existed since 1986 and made Steel Battalion Heavy Armor. Yeah, the guys that made one of the greatest games of all time also made one of the worst games of all time.
And doohickeys that it doesn't know what you want. See, look, I didn't want to do that. I just wanted to move forward. So it would be better if I just lean without any hands instead of using my hands. See, and now I come back for no reason. So go forward. Alright. But what the fuck am I... Come on, stop. And then he grabs all this shit. Stop grabbing stuff. I mean, the atmosphere is wonderful. The characters are awesome. The dialogue is funny. The only problem is the goddamn connect. It's a freaking bottleneck.
So with that context now set up, we can take a look at the game as both a standalone title and as an entry in director Hidetaka Miyazaki's series of games. Upon first sight, it would seem that the game is similar to Dark Souls. You got a very vague introduction that sets the tone, a difficult first challenge that's survivable, opening double doors with the same animation, a fairly similar interface, the lack of music outside of safe zones and boss fights, and checkpoints disguised as light sources that also have warping abilities. But the fundamental differences between the two are how the enemies behave, the way the combat sequences are laid out, and how the game controls, but I'll get to that in a little bit. First, I want to talk about the presentation. Bloodborne's audio ranges from excellent to sometimes questionable. The atmosphere of this game is spot on, which is especially important given that there is no background music for most of the game. At times you might just stop after defeating another set of enemies just to take in the atmosphere, for it is likely to give out a more threatening tone than the visual presentation, but more on that later. Alongside the ambience are some specific sound effects that range from ongoing to one-off beats. At times, you'll find that the ambience changes once you complete a section of the game, and it's hard not to appreciate that. The weapon sound effects are remarkable considering how many weapons there are. There isn't anything half-baked in the sound quality, and it evokes the grimy and almost handcrafted nature of the weapons. Each contact it makes with any object, whether it be enemy or environment, adds to the already visceral and crunchy combat. Using items also gives out the right sound effects that can range from threatening to slightly hopeful to alien to downright terrifying. Every boss fight, regardless of their size or nature, makes a sound effect that will make you feel uneasy, with some of the emotion also coming from the voice acting, but more on that in a short while. For now I want to talk about the music. Previous From Software composers Shunsuke Kida and Motoi Sakuraba didn't contribute to the soundtrack, which is partially understandable. Sakuraba was busy composing the 35 core tracks in Dark Souls 2, which was developed alongside Bloodborne. But it's odd that Kida didn't make a contribution since his Demon Souls soundtrack has clearly influenced both Dark Souls and Bloodborne. Whatever the case, the game's 25 music tracks were composed by not one, not two, but 6 different composers whose previous contributions to the entertainment industry range from Mass Effect 3 to Elysium. With the responsibilities of music now spread out between these composers, with Ryan Amon likely acting as the lead composer with 12 tracks under his name, it's clear that each track has a unique feel to them. A significant number of these tracks have a deliberate sense of pacing which fits into the game design. It's also a lot more calmer than its predecessors, which are normally characterized as being loud at the start, sometimes a little quieter in the middle, but most of the time they are bombastic. Most of the music in Bloodborne has some sort of suitable build-up, with it ranging from beautiful and emotional to creepy and unnerving. Keep in mind that most of the time, these tracks will not play. With the exception of the Hunter's Dream and the boss fights, you are not going to hear any of the wonderfully composed tracks. Their appearance is almost an event within itself, which likely contributes to how these soundtracks are fondly remembered. What's even rarer is the voice acting. Since you are barely going to find a friendly face in Yharnam, only a small handful of voice actors are given a sizable amount of lines.
Are you that outsider? Well, sorry, but I don't want anything to do with you. Trot along, will ya?
Some actors perform more than one role, and it's surprising that it's hard to identify who voice acted whom. Iveta Muradasilova returns from Demon Souls, but this time plays a literal life-size doll. Her performance is arguably the second best one in the game, adding a layer of emotion to an emotionless character.
Hello, good hunter. I am a doll, here in this dream to look after you. Honorable hunter, pursue the echoes of blood, and I will channel them into your strength.
The best voice actor is Alan Cordiner, who plays as Gehrman, the Hunter's Guide. He gives off a Mr. Filch vibe, which isn't surprising considering the actor played Mr. Filch in the majority of Harry Potter games.
You're sure to be in a fine haze about now, but don't think too hard about all of this. Just go out and kill a few beasts. It's for your own good.
Even some of the minor performances give out the perfect atmosphere for what the game is aiming for. They're untrustworthy and vague at best, and sometimes it's creepy.
Well, if you hunters got off your asses, you wouldn't be in this mess. You're obligated to help me, you hear?
But you can't have a video game without visuals, and fortunately, the game provides some great visuals by the truckload. The animations and graphics are artistically better than all of the other PlayStation 4 exclusives combined. If you take a look at the other PlayStation 4 release, The Order 1886, you can clearly see a stark contrast. In terms of rendering operations and sheer graphical output, then The Order wins, but it sacrifices personality and it just comes across as bland and lifeless. And when your game looks bland, then your environments are going to become forgettable. Bloodborne, like The Order, focuses on a Victorian Gothic aesthetic, filled with narrow streets and a sense of rotten air. The majority of your time will be spent within the city of Yharnam, but the subtle graphical changes from lighting colours to small texture changes make each environment look and feel different. There are some minor physics operations applied throughout the game, especially on plant life and cloth that add a nice little touch to the game. There's Havoc ragdoll physics and very few assets and enemies disappear when killed, making for some really goofy moments. There is also some minor smoke particles generated throughout the game that can range from small discharges from the drainage system to atmospheric fog that is only applied through carefully selected areas. The Souls series has experimented with smoke effects before, but it's mostly been used as an explicit effect rather than a subtle and atmospheric effect. This small change gives the city a filthier vibe to them, more than any visible marks in the textures. The character design, both sort of friendly to enemy, gives off an uncanny and dangerous look to them. The variety may be smaller than other Souls games, but their designs and telegraphed attack animations have been given a layer of polish. The boss fights are also unique in their looks and animations. If anyone remembers Dark Souls 2, you'll remember that the majority of the boss fights consisted of guys in suits of armor, which was a total shame. The vast majority of the boss fights within Bloodborne are twisted monstrosities with a unique look to them, from physics to animations to the brilliant sound design.
Grant us eyes. Grant us eyes.
This means that you'll be more than likely to describe the look of the boss fights when a name is mentioned, rather than unknowingly blend several of them into one horrible category, which is a plus when it comes to art design. But a game that looks good on a console means that the game must have some sacrifices, both major and minor, and surprise surprise, this game has them. For an action game like this, it really is a shame that it runs at 30 frames per second. That I can personally deal with, but from what I'm hearing about, the frame rate is concerning. In my 40-hour campaign, which had me explore as much as possible, my frame rate was kept at a consistent 30 frames per second without any noticeable drops. But from what I'm hearing and seeing from other people, their frame rate sometimes drops to almost unplayable levels. Now, I was an exception to this rule, but I did have my fair share of problems and gripes. If you look really, really hard, you can find areas that are incomplete, which can boggle your mind. It's likely that there are more of these around, but just finding this one took some serious amount of effort. But then there are the passive problems. Around the Cathedral Ward, I encountered a noticeable amount of texture and asset popping, which gave my immersion a hairline fracture, but at one point, entire assets and textures failed to load in for about 30 seconds, which was hilarious, but also fairly tragic. About the halfway point, the sound of attacks seemed to glitch out, and sometimes it sounded like several layers of the same sound is playing at the same time. And if you have no idea what that sounds like, allow me to show you. Now, those presentation problems can range from player to player and might have slipped through the cracks during testing, but then there's one problem that made my jaw drop in shock. Towards the end of the game, I came across an open elevator. No biggie, elevators are present throughout the game, but this particular elevator took me to the game's void. I was walking on nothing and could look up to the rest of the map. The void even had a wall, which I thought was a bit odd. Upon further investigation, I actually discovered that this area was intentional, and I'll open that can of worms later in the video, but it's hard to deny that this place is visually unpolished. But you can't talk about presentation problems without mentioning the loading times. For people who don't know, Bloodborne has loading screens that can last approximately 45 seconds each. And since you have to go back to the Hunter's Dream to warp to a location, that means you're going to encounter a noticeable amount of loading screens. But the duration of the loading screens aren't the problem. If the human mind is distracted, then time passes much faster. But if the human mind thinks of how long something is, it's going to make the loading screens psychologically longer.
Back at the lab, our two volunteers are testing out whether time really does fly when you're having fun. Albert Einstein, in his theory of relativity, said, "An hour in the company of a pretty girl seems like a minute." That sounds a bit like guesswork to us, so unlike Einstein, we're doing a proper scientific study. Psychologists believe that if we're involved in, for instance, a boring activity, then we think more about the time that is passing by. And hence, it seems as though the clock is ticking more slowly. On the other hand, when we're involved in fun activities, our mind is in a state of arousal, and the part of the brain which views the passage of time gets distracted. That's why your holidays seem to pass quickly.
In games like Deus Ex Human Revolution, the amount of loading screens is cushioned by the useful information regarding gameplay and story, and if Bloodborne had that, then the loading times wouldn't be as bad. Turns out having a static logo saying the title of the game in front of a plain black background isn't exactly interesting. At least give us information about weapons and items. And I know From Software can do this because they did that in Dark Souls! The 1.03 patch actually did address that criticism word for word. Not only are the loading screens now replaced with item descriptions as seen in the Dark Souls games, but have reduced the loading times by 5 to 15 seconds. So not only are the screens shorter, but they also feel shorter. The one negative side effect of the improvement is that the gameplay suddenly jumps in from the loading screen, instead of fading in like it did before. Here's a better demonstration of the improvements. The redesigned screens are also a good incentive to explore the world in a way, but more on that very shortly. But the visuals are only the middle or bottom piece of the pyramid, designed to give impact and to aid the player in their journey. In a game like this, the player needs to stay engaged through other means other than sound or visuals. If you have a good story but bad gameplay, that can get you over the minimum requirements for a good game. But if the story is terrible, but the gameplay is excellent, that could put your game in the same position, if not higher.
Perhaps the same could be said of all religions.
Your words are as empty as your soul. Mankind ill needs a savior such as you.
What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets. But enough talk. Have at you!
Since Bloodborne is focused more on gameplay and places the story in a background role, it will not only need to be fantastic, but also addicting. So let's take a look at the gameplay and design. If you've played Dark Souls, then the controls are going to seem second nature. Thumbsticks move the character and camera. X is your action button. Square uses the item in your inventory. Circle dodges, sprints and jumps, while R1 and R2 makes your character attack at speeds determined by what weapon you are using. Right directional button changes your primary weapon, left changes your secondary weapon, and down cycles through your quick inventory selections. There are some changes in the controls that go with the different combat style though. For starters, your healing is mapped to the triangle button and is determined by the amount of blood vials in your inventory. You can hold 20 on your person, unless you equip some upgrades, and 100 in your storage. When you die, any blood vials left in your storage will automatically be transferred to your inventory, so you don't have to go back to the Hunter's Dream to top up your blood vials, but more on that in a little bit. L2 is mapped to the secondary attack function, which will either be firing your gun, or a different attack if you have a two-handed weapon. L1 acts as another weapon switching button, only this changes your light attack weapon into a heavier attack weapon, so you can change your saw cleaver into the equivalent of a classy, if rusty, shaver. However, depending on your recent movements, you can use the L1 button to not only switch weapons, but also perform a really classy and hard-hitting attack. Despite being only able to equip 2 weapons and 2 guns, it acts more like 4 weapons and 2 guns. The difference between this and Dark Souls is that your starting class doesn't nail you to a certain weapon. You can start with a choice of 3 weapons and 1 of the 2 guns, and none of them seem to be overpowered at the start, middle or end. As you go on, you get the opportunity to purchase other weapons, such as a sword and sledgehammer, or the ever-popular sword and bigger sword. Another thing that is different from Dark Souls is that you can save your appearance, so you can select it if you want to do another playthrough, though the option of New Game Plus might make the option useless ranging from person to person. You cannot buy weapons from the outset, but over time you will retrieve the equivalent of weapon licenses via the badge system. Depending on who you kill or who you help or where you go, you might find a relevant badge which will unlock your ability to purchase certain weapons. You can buy and sell weapons and you can upgrade them via the workshop. In order to upgrade, you will not only need blood echoes, but you will need resources. These can be found around the world, though some of the more valuable resources are extremely difficult to find, to the point that there is literally only one of the most valuable resource in the entire game. Even in Dark Souls you could farm the most precious resource, even if doing so was a dangerous challenge in itself. You might have heard a little earlier that the most popular weapon is a sword that turns into a bigger sword, and that's not just by numbers alone. When you go into co-op or PvP, you are more than likely to encounter someone with that blade. It's quick in its first form and it's relatively powerful without sacrificing vast amounts of speed in its second form. But you can go further by enhancing your weapon temporarily. One particular weapon has a secondary option to electrify it, but at other times you will have to manually apply these enhancements, which will more than likely cost a certain amount of quicksilver bullets or come as an extremely expensive item. These abilities can range from an arcane buff to a fire buff, but you are more than likely to use them in PvP. Not all weapons can have these buffs, so it would be best to research, especially if you're going to fork out 10 grand for a resource that is finite. What is almost finite, depending if you're playing online passively or not, is your insight. Insight is a resource that can be used to buy things, or some of the lesser upgrade resources. If you've played Dark Souls, they work like a unique version of humanity. They can be obtained via items and passively, and you can't start upgrading your character until you have at least one insight, which can take some time depending on your skill. When you die, you won't lose insight with your blood echoes, and the only way you can lose them is via some enemies or through the shop. You can only hold a maximum of 99 insight, so if you use the Madman's Knowledge when you're at 99, too bad, you've lost that insight. To access the shop, you're going to need at least 10 insight. Items you need to buy from this shop include the sinister resonant bell and the small resonant bell, for they are used to join other players' worlds. If you're playing offline, you can buy special clothes from this store if you wish. You can gain insight by encountering bosses. You get one from your first fight, regardless if you fail or succeed, and you get some more when you kill them. If you are up for online, then you can get insight by helping players, or killing them while in a certain covenant, but more on that later. Alongside insight being used as a currency, it can also change how strong your enemies are, your resistance to frenzy, which will be crucial in one part of the game, and how the environment changes around you. You might see things you haven't seen before, and information about characters might reveal themselves to you. There is no loss for carrying insight alongside from one stat change, and it seems like there is no real advantage to carrying the Madman's Knowledge instead of consuming them, aside from certain enemies possibly sucking insight out of you. From what you might have seen from the marketing, you would assume that Bloodborne is half melee combat and half shooter, or you can revert to shooting completely, but that isn't the case. Unlike your primary weapons, your guns only have one button, and all that does is fire. You can either fire freely, fire at a locked-on target, or manually aim. Keep in mind that using manual aim is not recommended in the middle of combat, and you can't fire your weapon when you're on ladders. Aside from maybe the cannon and flamethrower, your guns will be used as a staggering technique. Fire your weapon, if it hits, the enemy will stagger for a second, hit them at exactly the right time, then they will be open for a devastating visceral attack. Some primary weapons even have guns as a secondary option, but will consume quicksilver bullets nonetheless. Going back to that pseudo first-person mode, you get access to this by finding the monocular after the first mandatory boss fight. Using it adds a crosshair to the centre of the screen, while also moving the camera forward so it looks like it rests on the character's shoulder. Seems pretty decent at first sight, since you can do almost all the actions you could already without this change. Unfortunately, the side effect of this mode is that you have absolutely no idea what's going on around you. The camera controls slow to a crawl, and your character moves at the snail's pace. The only way you can move quickly in this mode is if you use the dodge button, since your sprint function is disabled. I will be genuinely surprised if someone could make it through the entire game solo with that monocular, but at almost all times you will be using it for recon, just taking in the atmosphere, or not at all. If you are using it for atmosphere, then you can take advantage of the ability to disable the HUD, which will take away every visual indicator, minus the pickup notifications, messages, online pop-ups, and subtitles, the latter of which have their own separate option settings. Each weapon uses a certain amount of bullets depending on firepower and function. The blunderbuss uses 1 bullet, and the cannon uses 10 in the vanilla version, and 12 after the 1.03 patch. Since you cannot pick up items in PvP and can only carry 20 bullets at a time, you might want to consider your options. There is an option to instead use a wooden shield, but you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who would actively use it, since the combat takes an offensive role in contrast to Miyazaki's previous work. The controls, the weapons, and the guns have been tailored to suit fast-paced action instead of a slow, more defensive game of logistics. Despite this game being about attacking, it is still a management game in the background. You still have your stamina, which depletes if you run or attack, and performing a charged R2 attack might deplete your stamina completely. For players of other Souls games, you will notice some fundamental differences in item and character stats. The biggest difference in the combat is that weight and poise are no longer factors in the way your character moves, so holding a heavy hammer will still allow your character to sidestep quickly. In its place, enemies hit a little harder depending on your character level, and move in packs. Another major difference between this game and Dark Souls is that there is no Estus Flask mechanic. For those unaware, the Estus Flask was an item in Dark Souls that would heal you upon request. While the amount of times you can use it was finite, it would effectively recharge upon resting at the game's equivalent of a checkpoint. In Dark Souls 2, the Estus was drastically turned down in favour of consumable life gems that would gradually recharge your health, and you'd have to either find them or buy them. In Bloodborne, there is no recharging health system, though the blood vials, which acts as the game's equivalent of life gems, heals at the speed of the Estus. You can find blood vials everywhere in the city, and if you find all of those, you can find them as drops from certain enemies. Some of them are guaranteed to drop a certain amount, but if you don't want to go through the trouble of memorizing them, then you can buy them from the standard shop in the Hunter's Dream. Keep in mind that the price of consumables goes up as you progress through the game, so when you're achieving 10k per kill, you're going to be forking out more cash for your health. There is another way to regain your health, and that is by, well, attacking. For anyone who has played a fighting game, then you might be familiar with the way the health bar works. Once you get hit, the amount of damage you took turns into a different colour. After a couple of seconds, that colour disappears. If you land successful blows against an enemy without getting hit again during those few seconds, the damage you deal will regenerate your health. You can also regenerate your health by going to the Hunter's Dream and back, but doing so will bring the enemies back and you'd have to go through 2 loading screens. Another way to regain your health, however impractical, is to die. If you die, then you will be sent back to the last lamp you either warped to or turned on. When you die, the enemies respawn, but you will lose all your blood echoes, which, if you remember, is used to level up and purchase items. The game will not give you any leeway. You will lose all your blood echoes, but it also gives you the opportunity to recover your lost currency. Like Dark Souls, if you die, a little puddle of blood will be left on the ground, and you can go there and pick it up. Quite simple. But with the game's focus on offensive combat, there is a chance that a nearby enemy will absorb the currency. If that's the case, then you'll have to go to where you died and fight the enemy with the glowing eyes. Regardless of their design, the glowing eyes will also give off a small smoke effect, so it's easy to find them. If you kill them, your echoes will come back instantly. If you die before you retrieve your blood echoes, then too bad, they're gonna be gone forever. If you die in a boss battle, rest assured that you will never have to kill that boss to retrieve the echoes. It will always come as a puddle of blood. And now on to the enemies, which is actually quite weird that I'm covering this aspect now, given that these are the guys we are actively hunting, fighting, and killing. The variety of enemies on this game isn't as wide as Dark Souls, but they are very interesting designs nonetheless. You have your regular human-ish enemies. You have your hard-hitting big lads. You have a monster that looks like the slaughtering grounds is stolen artwork. But more importantly, all those enemies are dangerous regardless of what level you are at. Some of these enemies will reappear in later parts of the game, and they are still as hard as you remember them originally. The fact that these guys are rarely seen alone makes them a threat in itself. If you see one guy you've met and defeated before, there is a possibility that you will be ambushed seconds after engaging them. The only time you might see them on their own is when they are being introduced. Take the first few minutes of the game for example. You encounter two different types of enemies doing something on their own, and once you get past them, you rarely see them alone again. Meeting an enemy you have never seen before is like some sort of ritual. You might see them perform something unique or are in an area of the game specifically designed to introduce them, and then you might not see them on their own for the remaining 30 hours of gameplay. One thing to take note of is that some of the smallest enemies are going to be the ones giving you a hard time, especially the crows and the dogs. These creatures move like crazy and have some of the most horrific sounds in the entire game. Even when you know their attack patterns, they will often kill you again and again, and if that wasn't enough, the dogs normally come in twos with different enemies alongside them. You will find them in almost every area of the game, and it's horrifying each time. But like most RPG and action games, you have boss fights, and unlike most RPG and action games, they are not a cakewalk and are not repetitive. Despite all of them being an examination of resources, animation, dodging, and strategy, they all approach you in a different way. They act almost like regular enemies, except they have more moves, have more health, and hit much harder. If you don't dodge at the right time or in the right direction, you're going to have a bad time. You are going to go through several bosses to finish the game, and the optional bosses equal or even exceed the mandatory bosses you have to go through. And that doesn't count the Chalice dungeon bosses, which, trust me, I will get to shortly. These bosses are larger than you in scale, and they move quickly, and to add to the test, their tactics change at select points in the battle. It makes the combat exciting the same way that the Ornstein and Smo fight did in Dark Souls. Their movesets will change, and they might have a gimmick that could change the entire course of the fight and your approach to it. The boss fights are a test of the player, and they are not unfair. If you get too close, you could lose track of your perspective, and if you go too far, they might do an attack that will not only get them close to you, but also deal massive amounts of damage. They aren't impossible, and you can get by these challenges on your own, and if you have trouble, then you can summon a friend. If there is anything wrong with these bosses, it's that, aside from some of the possible camera issues, the Metroidvania-style gameplay could mean that you might encounter a boss who might have a slightly disappointing health bar. Oh, they will give you a run for your money, or blood echoes, but you'd wish some of these fights would last a little longer. What's more puzzling is the way the Chalice dungeon bosses were designed, and with that we slide into the Chalice dungeons. Essentially, the Chalice dungeons are there to add more replayability to an action-oriented game. The way it functions is that the dungeons are randomly generated and are littered with enemies, bosses, and more importantly, loot. The problem is that these sections can either become intriguing or infuriating. If you don't return to the dungeons every now and then, you will end up sliding through some of the dungeons without much to be afraid of. The problem with this mode lies in the enemies and the bosses. At level 80 and in a level 3 dungeon, everyone started one-hitting my character, and the bosses became damage sponges, contradicting the way the core games were designed. Not only that, but with the exception of 2 or 3 bosses, these encounters can get extremely repetitive. I've lost count on how many times I've encountered the Merciless Watcher and Chieftain bosses, and it doesn't help that the boss theme is the same on every single fight. There are some exceptions to the music, and there are some interesting fights, but they are unfortunately clouded by the repetitiveness of other bosses. There is a possibility that you could encounter a previously defeated boss fight that was interesting, but the sizes of these arenas and the aesthetic these designs are going for just make the fights either frustrating or dull. They don't even make sense in a narrative sense once you start to understand some of the lore surrounding the bosses, and even the Chalice dungeons themselves. If they were bringing back bosses, they could have made a dungeon that was just a pure boss rush. That would have been neat for those that want to apply some self-imposed challenges without jumping through the technical hoops or restarting the game. Also, there are some texture clipping issues here and there. The procedurally generated raids may give out a different layout, but at times texture assets may collide with another to give out the typical blinking effect. I'll be fair, I can forgive that issue. If you are going to use these dungeons, it will probably be because you want to farm for upgrades and bloodstones, since the amount of blood echoes you get from these dungeons are unbalanced. Defeating a fairly difficult fight actually gave me very little, but then again it depends on your level. No, I don't expect the Chalice dungeons to be 100% balanced because random generation is going to leave some cracks, but it could have at least done some balancing, especially when it comes to some of the bosses. Some people have reported finding some of the more valuable bloodstones in these dungeons, but the loot algorithm in these dungeons mean that your experience will likely differ from those who reported these findings. But the biggest problem with the Chalice dungeons is, personally, they're boring. I thought there was a possibility to join other players in these dungeons, and there is a tombstone that matchmakes you into a Chalice dungeon, but even after the 1.03 patch, which worked on some of the multiplayer issues, there wasn't a response when I looked for one. And even then I had to wait for several minutes to invade, because you can turn invasions on and off on the tombstones, even when you have your game selected to online mode. I don't really have any reason to return to these dungeons aside from getting those 2 trophies, and to be perfectly honest, it does make farming for items a little more interesting. Speaking of farming, you will be farming for echoes, but the strange thing is that you won't be using them for leveling up most of the time. Due to the amount of blood vials you will be consuming, you will be trying to find good hotspots to find the most amount of blood vials, before returning to the Hunter's Dream to purchase them, before repeating the cycle. At times you will be using these vials quite frequently, so even if you max out your capacity, you will be returning to your sweet farming spot. If you're worried that the game will pull a Dark Souls 2 and stop respawning enemies after a certain number of times, I haven't encountered such an occurrence without there being some sort of scripted event to add context to the change, so you're safe there. Another reason to not level up would be due to the way the game's multiplayer component works. Multiplayer in this game isn't as simple as joining through a menu and inviting your friends, although there are ways to do that. Regardless of what you do, until you defeat the area boss, you are prone to being invaded by another player. Unlike Dark Souls, the fights are fairly simple, if more and more intense. If you want to invade another player, all you have to do is ring the sinister resonant bell and wait. If you think you can invade extremely weak players at the beginning of the game, think again. the person you invade or invades you will be within 10 levels plus 10% of your character, though highly skilled players may invade your world since there is no determinate way to measure the player's skill. When someone invades a world, their maximum health will be decreased by approximately 33%, but they will get that back once they return to their own world, which can be annoying for those looking for an even fight without any added worry. On the plus side, the servers are more stable than Dark Souls, and there is an option to exclusively play online at the start menu, which may not sound much, but to Dark Souls players who like to play solo without the fear of being invaded, they will sing Alleluia to the end of time. There are rewards for a successful fight, regardless of what side you are on. If you win a PvP match, you will gain some blood echoes, but if you join a certain covenant, you can gain a special item that you can either trade in or consume to get additional insight. If you don't want to get invaded but want to play online, there is a way to prevent invasions. In an area where you haven't defeated a boss, you may get a message saying that a woman has arrived in the game. She will also arrive if you ring the sinister bell, but if you're able to find her and kill her, you will stop incoming invasions in that current session. One thing that you will find odd if you take part in PvP is that you will stick to a well-established routine, even without realizing it. You invade or get invaded. You find each other. You bow before you fight. You fight. And the winner also bows. It's a nice little system, but what might catch you off guard is that you might be fighting more than one player if you invade. At most you will fight up to 3 players, but you can end this by killing the host while avoiding the others. If this was a slower game like Dark Souls, it might come across as frustrating, but due to the fast-paced combat, you will find yourself enjoying these unbalanced encounters. I sure did. You can leave this game by firing an item you receive early in the game, or if the host goes through the fog wall to fight the area boss. If you want to fight the boss with the host, or want some help with the area boss, then you can participate in jolly old cooperation. Joining a host works the same way as invading, though you'll be fighting alongside the host and you cannot attack the player. If you want to bring in a friend, then you can set a passcode in the network settings in the pause menu. As far as I know, this doesn't affect invasions, but it does make matching up with your friends a lot easier. Regardless if you want a friend or a random player, you will need to first ring the beckoning bell. Doing so opens your world to random friendly players, but will also consume 1 insight. If you die and nobody joined, don't expect to get that insight back. Another thing to take note of is that killing enemies will also give the other player the same amount of echoes you get, but loot will not be accessible to the foreign player. As you probably heard earlier, your co-op buddy can join the boss fight. If they are still alive when the boss is defeated, they will gain 1 insight and half the blood echoes that boss drops. Be warned, if you're in a covenant, there is a possibility that you might accidentally bring in a hostile player, regardless if you killed the lady with the bell or not. So how about them covenants? Well, they give the player a passive ability, but no matter which one you choose, it will focus almost exclusively on PvP. Dark Souls had 9 covenants, which focused on engaging in cooperation, taking part in invasions in the name of ambiguous evil or justice, or for the good of an NPC. They impacted the story due to some conflicts some covenants had with the main story. Bloodborne has 3 covenants that link with PvP. Hunter of Hunters Covenant just hunts other players, the Cainhurst Vilebloods kill other hunters to feed their queen, and the Executioners dedicate themselves to hunting down Vilebloods. In order to join the Covenant, just switch out one of your passive abilities that links with the Covenant. And that's it. What's actually quite interesting, if a little questionable, is what you have to do to join each covenant. The Hunter of Hunters Covenant will want you to follow a storyline, which involves ridiculously difficult encounters. The Canehurst Vilebloods will have you go to a new location, which, to be honest, deserves a lot more attention than it got. And the Executioners demand you do the same thing as the Vilebloods, but you bring back a simple unopened letter. The rewards you get for taking part in invasions while equipped with their passive is mostly ambiguous, but the Vilebloods give you an item which you can trade into the Covenant leader, or you can consume it for additional insight. Even though these Covenants are shallow and don't really have anything that offline players can follow, I do appreciate one minor detail that was added to the Executioners and Vilebloods. Because their lore pitted the two as mortal enemies, if you summon someone from one Covenant but are currently aligned with the other, you two end up becoming hostile to each other. It's the sort of thing I wished was in Dark Souls. Another aspect of Dark Souls that made a small return was the gesture system, which is the only way you can communicate with other players. Unless you invite them to a party or send them a message on PSN. Like I did. Multiple times. I always liked this sort of communication, which has sadly been undermined by this flaw, and I appreciate that they didn't factor fan service into these small animations. There is no sigh of relief loud enough when Praise the Sun isn't on the list of gestures. One little detail that was added was the doll's response to gestures. It's a small detail, but the human race loves small details.
Awesome. Right. She likes it. That's awesome. She likes it.
Funnily enough, there is actually a problem with the gesture system that isn't a bug. It's not the animations themselves. They're great. Fantastic even. The problem lies in their control method. You can perform them by pressing the left side of the touchpad, selecting which one you want to perform, and press X. Easy. But there is an alternative way to perform these. As you can probably tell, you can perform these actions by using the 6-axis motion on your controller, with the motion dictating which pre-selected action you have activated. Sounds simple, right? Yeah... no. The problem is that there is another thing you have to do before you can use the 6-axis function. I spent a good deal of time trying to get the 6-axis to work because the game does a poor job at explaining it to you. For a moment I thought it was because From Software programmed the motion controls poorly, which would make sense given the company's past. It took a Google search to find the answer, and it turns out you have to press the X button at the same time as doing the 6-axis motion controls to perform the gesture. Two problems. 1. The game does not tell you this. Not at any point in the entire game does it tell you to press X and use the 6-axis motion. Even the tutorial and this pathetic excuse for a manual doesn't tell you. I mean, come on. Problem number 2. Even if you know this control method and actively try to avoid it, you're still going to end up in situations where your character starts doing a gesture, and combine that with the inability to end the gestures in a quick fashion, it will make for some infuriating moments. And that leads me to another problem. Half of the analog inputs on your controller are too sensitive. Thumbsticks, fine. All good. And if you're not satisfied with the camera controls, you can change that in the options menu. The problem comes from the triggers. Lightly tap on them and they'll perform the action associated with it. Heavy attack or firing your gun. From Software could have taken advantage of the triggers and programmed it so you'd have to push them at least 1/3 of the way before the action is executed. It is a minor gripe, but it is something that needs to be pointed out regardless. But you can't talk about a video game unless you talk about the level design, and in order to understand how much I appreciate this aspect, I'm going to talk a little bit about the design of both Dark Souls games. In Dark Souls, a lot of these areas are connected to each other, both geographically and in environment collision detection. The design of each area contains shortcuts back to the checkpoints, which would encourage you to find your own preferred way to get to a boss fight. Often when you enter an area, you will find about 2 other ways inside. It felt like the levels were designed by an architect first, before the team looked to find directions the player could go. In Dark Souls 2, the levels had very little shortcuts and were designed like a typical video game, which would be fine by itself, but then you remember the level design philosophy of the first game. Once you go a certain direction, your journey might as well be a linear corridor. This led to one particular moment where I climbed a tower in the middle of a swamp, entered an elevator that went up, and somehow found myself in a castle located in the middle of a volcano. With Bloodborne being a Miyazaki game, it's obvious that some level design liberties from his previous work were added into this next-gen title. For starters, your main hub for almost everything is the Hunter's Dream. In this area, you can level up your character, purchase equipment and materials, apply passive upgrades to your character and weapon, customize your messages, believe it or not, and teleport around the game. Of all the areas in this game, this is the one where you will feel truly safe. There are no enemies to worry about, and the environment itself is beautiful and truly unique. If you want to return to the killing fields, just walk up to either a Chalice Tombstone or an Awakening Tombstone and select which area you want to teleport to. As you progress through the game, you will unlock more areas to teleport to, and some are more useful than others. While this makes travelling less tedious, especially if you're struggling to get through the game, I cannot help but think that warping from one lamp to the other could do with some serious work. From the lamp you can only go to one area, the Hunter's Dream, so you cannot warp directly to another lamp. This wouldn't be so bad if it wasn't for the boring and long loading screens that impede your flow, and it could have been fixed by having the ability to directly warp to one lamp from another lamp. And I know they can do this because they did it in Dark Souls 1 and 2. You might remember that I went through the PvP portion of the game, and there is one missing opportunity that I am truly puzzled wasn't brought up in the design meetings. Dedicated PvP arenas. There are going to be instances where players might be stuck in one part of the level, but are too high a level to join the multiplayer portions, especially in New Game Plus. It would have been nice if some areas of the game were reincorporated as dedicated PvP arenas, and not just popular hotspots. For example, the large, empty, bright arena of the Moonlight Lake would have been excellent for a balanced PvP arena, and it would have made good use of an area of the game that we have no reason to return to. You might remember way back that I thought I discovered an almost game-breaking issue regarding an elevator, and upon further investigation discovered that it was intentionally designed that way. That might go well with some of the story elements, but there are a few questions that seem to support my feeling that it was just randomly thrown in there. Or was a very last-minute design decision. Why was the creature unable to attack us despite falling into an area with no floor? I'm pretty sure a creature that can move their eyes and literally attack us with a thought could still attempt to kill us. Why does the elevator sound suddenly cut off halfway down the elevator ride? And before any of you bring up the science of sound equating to the lack of sound heard as we go deeper into the abyss, then answer this. Why can we hear the elevator with the same sudden silence when exiting the abyss? Why is it obvious that I can see the edges of the game assets? How is it that my character can walk into the void without the need of a special ring? How am I able to hear footsteps when they are not contacting solid surfaces? Cloth I get, but what about the footsteps? The strange thing is that this could have been fixed by adding darkness as a physical presence and not just be absence of light. And I know they can do this because they did it in Dark Souls! Oh god, I can make a drinking game out of this. But, despite these problems, if you are a game designer looking for inspiration, hear it from me. Bloodborne has some of the best level design in any game ever made. Its design apes the Metroidvania design the original successfully implemented, and went beyond that. A good amount of levels are optional areas, and From Software still designed them like architecture instead of, well, levels. Shortcuts are found within shortcuts, and best of all, there are multiple pathways to the same destination with radically different approaches. Do you buy an extremely expensive key to open a gate, or do you go through an improvised route full of danger to get to the same destination? There are a lot of shortcuts to unlock, and there isn't a feeling of uncanniness from the disconnected levels, despite the radically different environments at certain points. There is a lot more verticality to the levels, allowing for some really astonishing designs and encounters. Even the areas you might feel disconnected from the city feel connected when you've found the right pathway. You can go almost anywhere in this world without teleporting, provided you don't die, and there is a real sense of bigness. Also, if you are worried that there might be some impractical platforming, don't worry, there isn't. Though I did do some at my own free will, so jumping from one point to the other is an option that you won't be punished for choosing. Oh god, I take that back. Okay, there's this place you can go to called the Healing Church Workshop, and you can find yourself in this area. You have to jump from platform to platform as you go further and further down this tower. At the very bottom is a fairly difficult challenge, depending on your skill and level, and just getting there wastes your precious blood vials. Granted, this is an optional area, sort of, but come on, FromSoft, you can do better than that. Then again, the fact that this is an optional area and still designed to fit into the environment also demonstrates why I like the level design. It's a design philosophy that allows the players to explore at their own pace, and in their own special way. You can just run down the pathways and fight the bosses, or you can explore and find some secrets or pieces of lore, though at times exploration seems to be the solution to some problems and lingering questions. The placement of shortcuts and boss fights seem to encourage the player to explore. Remember the cleric beast? The black boss fight that was in the promotional material? That's an optional boss fight! The actual boss fight required to progress requires some exploration, and it's extremely rewarding once you find them. But the ultimate question for the gameplay as a whole is how replayable is it? After all, people are still playing Dark Souls over and over again, and Bloodborne borrows a lot of the same elements. There are arguments against Bloodborne's replayability, and they aren't exactly wrong. The Chalice dungeons are repetitive and grindy in a bad way, the loading screens can be a deal breaker if you don't have access to the internet, and there are significantly less weapons and trophies to grab. The game is streamlined in comparison to its predecessors, but it's not the negative remark it may sound like. The game is replayable in the same sense that games like Bayonetta are replayable. The fast-paced combat and the interesting and difficult boss fights makes this game an absolute joy to play. The PvP is surprisingly a lot of fun, providing you have a decent connection, and you are also free to come up with your own self-imposed challenges. You can beat the game on level 4, and hey, I might take myself up on that monocular challenge I mentioned a while back. So yeah, the game is very replayable because it's fun. I know that answer is too simplistic for some people, but it is fun. It sounds fun, its gameplay is fun, its levels are fun, and its bosses are fun, and really? Can I ask for more? But before I move on, I like to address a common misconception that seems to have recently popped up in regards to the door at the Cathedral Ward. Some people have suggested that this door links back to the Cleric Beast Bridge, but that doesn't make sense. The world is interconnected, so tell me why this bridge isn't as detailed as the one the boss fight took place on. How come the door on the cleric beast's side isn't interactable, but the one in the cathedral ward is? I seriously don't get why people drew up that conclusion. Yeah, the shiny coin trick is a strong case. Actually, it's almost concrete evidence, but it doesn't explain how barren the bridge is. Personally, I think this is a doorway to possible DLC, but if that was the case, then they could have just made the door not interactable, therefore the DLC plans wouldn't be as obvious. DLC or form a shortcut, it's hard to explain why this is only interactable from one side. So the gameplay and presentation is solid for the most part, and if the game were shipped that way, then it would have likely got the same critical acclaim. After all, the reviews either lightly touched on anything else but the visuals and how the game connected with the player on a kinesthetic level, and that isn't exactly surprising. When you play games like this, you normally neglect to think why you started this hunt in the first place. But, like Dark Souls, that particular story is itself a hunt on its own. This particular section of the video will cover this story explicitly told, the delivery method, some of the questions it presents, and the way that the ending can be interpreted using the different elements discussed previously. If you want to skip to the conclusion, go forward to this part of the video. I will give another warning before I talk about the final part of Bloodborne, but for now let's focus on the core aspects of the story. When a video game company decides to dedicate their limited development time to the story, there is a real possibility that the presentation, or worse, the gameplay, will be affected. That isn't to say that you can't have a good story with fantastic visuals and gameplay. The AAA industry and some independent games have successfully blended all three together. The problem is that for the AAA industry, the focus on story can go either way. The Order 1886's focus on story only resulted in a cliché, by-the-books narrative. Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zero's focus on gameplay and visuals ended up with a story that tried to be edgy, but came across as badly written, shallow, and childish. And with David Cage's talk on stories being emotional, his focus on trying to be Hollywood, in his more recent case trying to blend The Sixth Sense with Pulp Fiction, meant that his story was unpolished, and the only emotional it invoked from me, and many others, was anger. The way that Bloodborne presents its story is the same way that the player can use their imagination. Throughout the game, the player is presented with little pieces of information that might not make sense on first sight, but putting the pieces of the puzzle together yields some concrete narrative, and some left to the player's interpretation. A prime example of this mindset is at the very beginning of the game. As it is told, a foreigner has travelled to Yharnam to seek a cure to an illness. Since Yharnam has become a medical hotspot thanks to the Church of Healing, many people come to the city to seek a cure to whatever blight has plagued them. The foreigner becomes what is known to the world as a hunter, and they set off to find the cure to the plague that has torn the city apart. Or at least, that was what I was able to piece together. The philosophy behind this style of storytelling can actually be traced back to Hidetaka Miyazaki's childhood. When he was young, Hidetaka would read books from the library, and from his limited reading skills he was able to piece his own stories just using the bits he understood. Even if it doesn't sound compelling in speech or on paper, it truly is amazing to see what stories can be accomplished using small amounts of information, and it's an absolute joy when your imagination runs wild. You might have had a time during your childhood where you would read a book or a newspaper that was written with a vocabulary beyond your reading skills, so trying to make sense of the words or even asking questions about certain plot elements you didn't get was itself a journey. I remember listening to a book on tape rendition of a series of unfortunate events, and even some of the first Harry Potter books before me and my sister went to sleep. And even though some of those books were written for a younger audience, there was some stuff I didn't understand. I tried to fill in these blanks with some of the stuff I did understand, and could come up with a completely different tale that was far from the original source material. And in some ways, Bloodborne tries to recreate those times in our lives. Providing you don't go on a wiki for any information in regards to the lore, You might have a completely different take on the story, or even a different narrative altogether from not only the way the developers wrote it, but also how the players interpret. The game gives you an item, or a set of items, or a setting, and you can come up with stories that links those things together. The introductory chapter captures this mindset very well. If you ignored the promotional material or any of the plot synopsis online, then you are greeted with the face of Gehrman and dropped right in the middle of Yharnam. This whole section can give out a different context to the player, and even the whole game could give different players different reasons of progressing into the narrative, which is helped by the fact that the player character is completely designed by the player. For example, I could interpret the whole game as symbolic in a very meta way. The hunter is a representation of the player, the city is a representation of Bloodborne as a game, the cure to the plague is the satisfaction you achieve as you reach the later parts of the level, and the plague can be a representation of the last 2 years of the game industry. From what I could gather from cutscenes to pre-rendered cinematics to NPC interactions, the way one could become a hunter is by being administered some sort of blood. And the reason why there aren't many hunters around is due to A, the sad possibility that being a hunter could consume your humanity, from what the fight with Father Gascoigne suggested, and B, there is a widespread hatred or fear for hunters due to the city's reputation of blood as both a healing remedy and as a luxury, reinforced by some of the dialogue and the actions of the enemies. Despite its fairly expansive story during the first half, the game isn't afraid to pull you into the harsh reality of some of the littlest of stories that are, themselves, mostly complete. Despite a game like this being essentially about killing to find your own cure, the journey might not be light and could actually completely break you emotionally. There is a little girl by a window you can find early in the game, whom requests you find her mother. Their mother has gone out to look for her father, and she gives you a music box to assist you. During the fight with Father Gascoigne, you can use the music box to your advantage, which could indicate that the father is the little girl's dad, and if that wasn't enough, a corpse you can find shortly after carries a brooch. The exact brooch that the young girl told you her mother normally wears. You, in effect, just orphaned a child. Congratulations. There are many different stories you can interpret just because of this finding alone, and the game doesn't punish you if you didn't come up with the one the game thought of. The mother could have committed suicide when she saw her husband for the monster he was. She could have been killed by the Beast of Gascoigne, who might be racked with guilt to the point that he doesn't want hunters to become like him. She could have been attacked and died, or possibly caught in the crossfire. And if that wasn't enough, if you return to the little girl, this could go in 3 different ways. You could give her the brooch and she starts crying. She will later be consumed by a giant pig. You could tell her to go towards a nice safe spot, and she will die no matter which spot you tell her to go to. The game gives you the beginning and an end of the little stories it tells, and it will allow you to come up with an Act 2, and, in this case, unravel the tragedy. The game isn't afraid to plant ideas in your head through several means, through the interactions with the characters in regards to the city's past, to even the visuals and the level design. The colour scheme of the city shows some kind of dark side to the city controlled by the Healing Church, to the point where the strange, Lovecraftian horror doesn't feel like the game is jumping the shark, but feels more like it opens another avenue to explore. As I played through this game and came up with my own little stories, they were all grounded in reality with some fantasy dust sprinkled in. After all, I played Dark Souls multiple times and got by the game's story with that mindset. But when I started seeing this creature crawling outside of the church, I got scared, because by opening another door to beyond this world, not only does it make the world much larger, but it also makes the player feel soul-crushingly smaller, which goes fantastically alongside the difficulty. The visuals grew more tragic and morbid. The otherworldly and disconnected areas of the game would make any character crazy, and the game is all too happy to plant these tragic and expansive stories into your head. I love the fact that the game doesn't expect you to understand the story on your first run through, and can you really blame the game? The first time through this game, I saw a note about a spider that I really couldn't make any sense of. It could refer to the spider I accidentally killed, or Rom the vacuous spider, but upon reading it again, it makes total sense. The narrative is, in some ways, like Silent Hill, a game that gives you an answer and leaves cryptic pieces of information for you. But Silent Hill had a fixed equation, while Bloodborne gives you a multiple choice equation to an answer it has already given you, without it feeling like you've lost out on something. This is another reason, if not the prime reason, to why the game is so replayable, because there are situations and questions that you want to answer, but want to find the answers for yourself. Questions like, how did Eileen the Crow inherit the title Hunter of Hunters? If it's a widespread oath, then is there other Hunter of Hunters out there? Does that mean the hunter in Old Yharnam was part of the Covenant? And if so, does that mean the other hunter in this area is part of the Covenant? If the little girl left her house after receiving the brooch, why? She had a sister she could embrace. Where was the sister during this tragic time? Does the sister exist? Is the doctor in this clinic really the doctor we heard of? And speaking of, how did Gehrman enter the real world? How did the hunter come up with this specific layout of the dream? Does the doll really have feelings for us?
Hunters have told me about the church, about the gods and their love. But do the gods love their creations? I am a doll created by you humans. Would you ever think to love me? Of course. I do love you. Isn't that how you've made me?
The storytelling of Bloodborne may not have deliberately asked these questions, but it nevertheless gave us the elements to let our creativity thrive. And no other section is this fabulously demonstrated other than the final minutes of the game. Now, word of warning, if you haven't played the game to the end and don't want to be spoiled, I suggest you skip to this part of the video, because I am going to ruin a good part of it. I'll give you 5 seconds. Holy crap, this fight is awesome! When I originally played this game, I was completely shocked. I don't know about you, but I love the trope of the old man in a wheelchair for the whole series, or at least after several hours of on-screen time, getting up for one last dance. Not only that, but the design of this boss fight is fantastic! A few of you will obviously draw links to the final boss in Metal Gear Solid 3, though I personally believe Bloodborne executed this scenario much better. Despite Gehrman being an old man, he really does live up to the title, The First Hunter, and the music is so good. From Software have completely knocked this fight out of the park, and have possibly surpassed Gwyn's fights from Dark Souls. Okay, enough fanboying, onto the discussion. This entire scenario, from sound to visuals to gameplay, is a complete storyteller's paradise because there is so much you can think of in just this boss fight alone. Does Gehrman want to fight you, or is he trying to save you from taking his place or becoming something far worse? How did Gehrman become the first hunter and create this dream? How long has he been in that chair, and what was stopping him from standing up? Does this mean that we are the first hunter to not want to be released from the hunter's curse? What was Gehrman like in his prime? Is he protecting the interest of the Great Ones? Or is he the final barrier between the moon presence and the real world? That would sort of make sense considering the creature arrives when he's slain, regardless if you consumed the cords or not. Despite what path you choose, the overall theme of us being nothing but small and weak is enforced. You can wake up and still be trapped in the nightmare that Yharnam is in. You can replace Gehrman but be bound to the confined space, and as a possible puppet for the Great Ones. or you can take the Moon Present's place and be summoned once you are ready. There is no good or bad ending, and the world itself is small. And no matter what we do, our lives will still come to an end, in one way or the other. When I started to write this script, my initial goal was to say what was good and what was bad about Bloodborne. It was initially going to be a quick video like most of my previous work, but if this long deconstruction has taught me anything, it's that some of the most enjoyable games I can get into are the ones that seem light on the surface, but are mechanically and narratively deep underneath. My goal of this video was to present the game to you as both a continuation of Miyazaki's gamography, and under the fictional situation that this was a game that just came out from a studio that no one has heard of. The way I did this was just by highlighting the points that referred to Dark Souls, or required knowledge of Dark Souls to understand in my Word document. Most of the reviews I read or watched drew parallels with Hidetaka's previous masterpiece, and while I can't exactly blame them since the influence isn't exactly subtle, I wish those reviews had a bigger ratio between Bloodborne and Dark Souls callbacks, and if we're judging this video by that, then I guess I succeeded. In the end, I played a video game and wanted to talk about it while also injecting some of my subjective thoughts into it. From the narrative, to the mechanics, to the loading times, while also presenting a large amount of objectivity. If Bloodborne has given me anything at all, it's a great giant glimmer of hope. During my time writing this, a news article came out that said that during its first week of Bloodborne's release, Battlefield Hardline beat the game to first place despite it being on the shelves for a second week in the UK. The glimmer of hope came in when it said that it was only beaten by 22,500 units. And if a new IP on a single platform with deep mechanics and a deep story structure nearly beat a long-established multi-platform series by that amount of sales, it only demonstrates that gamers want more of this stuff. From Software may have had a slight fumble with Dark Souls 2, which was my game of the year last year, but with Bloodborne, they have established themselves as a highly respected studio known for extremely engaging and difficult games, despite its technical flaws. There is no way on earth that I have covered at least 50% of the story in this game, since more and more details will be coming out, and is coming out, and more people will be telling their stories for months or even years to come. A large subreddit community has been established, and a large amount of fan art has already been produced, and this game is barely a month old. If you want something to directly take from this video, let it be this. Bloodborne is an engaging experience that, despite its frustrations, will suck you in. If you have a PS4, this is a must-buy, since it's the most critically acclaimed release that you can't get elsewhere. The rabbit hole only goes deeper, and it's up to us to figure out what waits for us at the bottom.